Hello, students. This is Dr. Rudman, and this video is going to be a short introduction to writing vocal music that will set us up for a couple more in-depth lessons about writing vocal music. Um, so, as usual, I'd like you to start out with some um, brainstorming. So again, you can pause the video and come up with some thoughts about the two questions on the screen. So first, I want you to come up with different types of pieces you can think of that use the voice. And then the second thing I want you to think about is what are some of the things you should consider when you're writing for voice or voices? So go ahead and pause the video, come up with some thoughts about those, and then the rest of this video is going to sort of talk through those questions. So there's lots of different genres that include voice. I'm going to focus on pieces that sort of fall into the classical realm, but of course, in rock and popular music and indie and jazz and um, all kinds of other music, you'll also find voices. So, in terms of uh, classical genres that involve voice, um, one of the most common is what's called art song, otherwise known as Lied, Lied, which is just German for song, or song cycles. So, an art song is a piece typically for one singer accompanied by piano, and it usually sets a pre existing text. Very often that could be a poem, but it could also be some kind of prose, for example, a letter or a diary entry or a speech, um, or even an excerpt from a novel or short story. But usually it's some kind of pre-existing text that is of high quality and that the composer thinks is worth combining with music. Sometimes composers do write their own texts. That's another option. But a lot of art song and song cycle uses pre-existing text. Art song is what we would call a single piece, a single movement piece for singer and piano. A song cycle would be a collection of multiple songs, usually that have some kind of common thread, either having a similar theme throughout, or possibly telling a story throughout, or all written by the same poet. Um, and there's variations of this genre where instead of having a pianist for the accompaniment, you might have a chamber ensemble, or you might even have a full orchestra. But generally, there's one singer accompanied by piano. Sort of larger scale genres of vocal music would be musical theater and opera. And these are dramatic pieces that use music and staging to tell a story. And typically, there's going to be a cast with multiple singers who might sing solo songs, or they might sing duets or trios, or even full choruses. Um, Unlike art songs or song cycles, this is usually happening on a stage. There's usually costumes and sets, and people are acting things out. We also have choral music, where there are groups of singers, um, typically not, in costumes or with sets or things like that, but just a group of singers. And there's a variety of configurations of choruses, which we'll talk more about in a future lesson. Um, but generally, it's a group of singers with multiple people on a part, um, and it could be accompanied or unaccompanied. And then there's other genres that also involve the voice. oratorio, which is another sort of large scale um, vocal work using solo singers, possibly chorus, maybe an orchestra. It's usually not staged with costumes and scenery, though. And then there's a cantata, which is somewhat similar to an oratorio. You can also have pieces where it's incorporating a narrator. So the voice is actually speaking rather than singing. So each of these different genres of vocal music will have different considerations, but there are a lot of common things that you will want to think about when you are writing for the voice. So the first sort of big question is, who are you writing for? And this can get broken down into a few sort of subtopics. So first, the forces. What performers are you using in your piece? Are they singers that are singing the text, or one or more people that are speaking text? How many people do you have? Is it one person? Is it a small group where there's one person on a part? Is it a larger group like a chorus where you have multiple singers on a part? And so on. Also, if you are using singers as opposed to narration, what voice types do you have? There's a variety of different voice types based on range and color, and that's going to affect the music that you write. We'll talk more in detail about voice types in a future lesson, but that's one of the things that you would want to consider. And then you would think about the accompaniment. Do you have an accompaniment, or is it a cappella? If you do have an accompaniment, is it piano? Is it organ? Is it a chamber ensemble? Is it some solo instrument other than piano? Is it an orchestra? Is it a band? Thinking about what instruments you have to support the voices is also very important. And then you want to think about the level of the performers you're writing for, both in terms of the singers and any instrumentalists that are doing the accompaniment, because that's going to greatly impact what you can write, in terms of range, in terms of rhythm, in terms of complexity of the texture and the independence of the parts. So the level of the performers is going to be very important to consider. And you also probably want to think about who your audience is and what occasion the piece is being written for. Um, if you are writing a piece for a school choir to do at their year-end concert, that might guide you towards one type of piece and one type of text you might want to set. If you are writing a piece to be performed at a religious service, that might be a different kind of text and a different kind of mood that you want to have. If you're writing a piece for a show choir competition, that would be a totally different kind of thing. So thinking about who's going to hear the piece and when and where can help you to um, make the piece appropriate in terms of the mood and in terms of the choice of text. And when you're writing for voices, text is a huge consideration. So first, you have the choice of whether or not to even include a text. You could choose to do what's called vocalese, where you're singing on neutral syllables, like an ah or an ooh, or even made up words. In that case, you don't necessarily need to think about the meaning of the text because it's not words that have meaning and that need to come together to form a clear message. But most of the time, you probably want to use a text because that's one of the great things about vocal music is that you have the power of specificity um, in terms of communication through a text. When we write instrumental music, we can convey general moods and general shapes and general feelings, um, but conveying a very specific meaning is tricky in instrumental music, um, because it's very abstract and it's very subjective. When you have a text, you have a much greater potential for being able to communicate clearly. And that's one of the things that often draws composers to writing vocal music, is that they have the ability to communicate something very clearly with an audience using the text. So that's, something to consider, is whether you want text or whether you want to write vocal music that does not have text. If you do go for finding a text, um, there's a lot of options for where to find texts. You may have come across a text in English class that you like. You may have a friend who writes poetry that you want to collaborate with. You might write poetry yourself and want to set some of your own texts. Um, you can also find a lot of texts online. Um, there's a variety of websites that are helpful, and I will link some of them in the Google Classroom page so that you can check out some options. When you are choosing a text, you're also going to want to think about whether or not it's under copyright. Copyright means that the author of the text owns that text and can control how it's used. And so if you want to use a text that is under copyright, you need to get permission from whoever holds the copyright. Often that'll be the author. It may possibly be a publisher. It might be an estate if the author is deceased. Anything that is not under copyright is referred to as public domain. And works enter the public domain when the copyright expires. And depending on the development of copyright laws, that date gradually shifts over time. Right now, anything written before the early 1920s is probably in public domain, so you're usually pretty safe with that. But it's good to look online to check and see if you can find out if a text you want to use is under copyright or not. It's not that you can't use something that's under copyright, but you need to contact the copyright holder and request the permissions. And they have the option to say, yes, go ahead, or to say, no, you cannot do that, or to say, yes, but I would like you to pay me some money. So when you're choosing your texts, be aware of whether or not they're under copyright. And if they are, then make sure to get permission before you set the text. There are a lot of composers who have horror stories about falling in love with the text and setting it to music and creating a piece they're super happy with, only to find out that whoever owns the copyright won't give them permission, and so they can never really use the piece. They can't have it performed, they can't record it, they can't send it to other performers, they can't share it online. So always, always, always make sure that if you're using a text under copyright, you get permission before you write the music. Once you have a text, you want to spend a lot of time thinking about the meaning of the text. And you might think about if there's any ways that you can musically represent ideas from the text. And this is what we would call text painting or word painting, where the music represents in some concrete way a word or phrase from the text. So if the text said running, you might use faster note values. Or if the text said going down, you might use a descending melodic line. Um, or if the text talked about a babbling brook, you might make the accompaniment have a sort of gentle water-like quality to it. So you might think about whether there's opportunities for text painting in the words that you've chosen. And then the most important thing for when you actually start getting into the composing is thinking about the prosody of the text. Prosody refers to where the syllables are stressed in the words and setting them in a way that makes it clear what the words are. If you are emphasizing weaker syllables instead of stronger syllables, it's going to be very hard for people to understand what you're saying. So you want to think about what are the emphasized syllables in your text and how can you use rhythm and placement within the meter to make that clear so that a listener knows what is being sung. Oftentimes, concert programs for vocal music will include the texts so that the audience can read them as well as hear them, but you can't count on that. So one of the composer's main jobs in setting text to music is to do it in a way that the text will be clearly understood by a listener. So I could talk to you about that for a while, but there's actually a really excellent video that's already been created by another composer. So I'm going to post that for you next.